Documentários. Inventores da psicanálise. Christopher Bollas, 1943. Decifrador da psicanálise. Christopher Bollas nasceu em 1943 na Califórnia, Estados Unidos, onde passou sua infância e sua adolescência no período em que a sociedade americana viveu a Guerra Fria, a ameaça nuclear, as lutas pelos direitos civis e outros acontecimentos significativos, como a Guerra do Vietnã. Esse ambiente o influenciou na formação de um pensamento livre, independente, criativo e imerso em um intenso sentimento humanista. Graduou-se em História pela Universidade da Califórnia, Berkeley, e é doutor em Literatura pela Universidade de Buffalo, Nova York. O estudo do puritanismo na Nova Inglaterra no século XVI o conduziu à literatura psicanalítica. Após a graduação, iniciou o trabalho clínico com crianças autistas ao longo de 2 anos em uma clínica na Califórnia. Em Nova York, dedicou-se à psicoterapia de estudantes da universidade onde cursava seu programa de doutoramento. Em 1973, iniciou sua formação psicanalítica em Londres, filiando-se ao denominado Middle Group, ou Independent Group, da Sociedade Britânica de Psicanálise, grupo de psicanalistas que não se vinculavam plenamente ou não se identificavam com as postulações dos psicanalistas reunidos em torno de Melanie Klein e Anna Freud. Entre 1978 e 1991, foi professor e supervisor clínico no Instituto de Neuropsiquiatria Infantil da Universidade de Roma. Além do aporte freudiano, a obra de Bollas revela a influência de autores como Francis Tustin, Donald Winnicott, Wilfred Bion e Jacques Lacan. Do muito que aprendeu com os grandes mestres da psicanálise e da literatura universal, destaca-se o papel de Winnicott, de quem Christopher procura ampliar as ideias acerca do papel do objeto nas relações interpessoais e da expressão do self. Sua agenda de pesquisa e seus escritos abordam inúmeras questões, do sonho à interpretação, da associação livre à poética, da normose à histeria e as mais diversas psicopatologias. Bollas inovou ao discorrer sobre a noção de self, o uso do objeto, as pulsões de vida e de morte, entre outros conceitos clínicos. Além do mais, seus escritos têm uma peculiaridade. São psicanalíticos em seu conteúdo, mas literários em sua estrutura, dificultando o trabalho dos tradutores de sua obra. Christopher Bollas é autor de uma vasta obra no campo psicanalítico, nas ciências humanas e nas artes, além de ser pintor, com imagens de suas obras ilustrando capas de livros. Fez sua formação psicanalítica na Sociedade Britânica de Psicanálise, da qual é membro. Suas postulações estão expressas em cerca de 15 livros de sua autoria, além de artigos e apresentações de obras. Em português, temos os seguintes títulos traduzidos: Histeria, 2000, Sendo um Personagem, 1998, originalmente publicado em 1992, Forças do Destino, Psicanálise e Idioma Humano, 1992, originalmente publicado em 1989. A Sombra do Objeto, Psicanálise do Conhecido Não Pensado, 1992, originalmente publicado em 1987. Quanto tempo temos? A versão curta é: eu sou Christopher Bollas, psicanalista, Sociedade Britânica de Psicanálise, morando agora em Santa Barbara, na Califórnia. Eu tenho 73 anos, sou um homem britânico e eu não sei mais o que dizer sobre mim. Mas se vocês fizerem perguntas sobre minha história e o passado, eu responderei da melhor forma possível. Eu não acho que eu mudei muito. Acho que faço a mesma coisa que eu sempre fiz, que é apenas escutar meus pacientes e aprender com eles. Porque, como sabemos, não existem duas pessoas iguais. Cada um é muito diferente do outro. E por isso, cada psicanálise é diferente. E por isso que cada técnica, se você acredita no inconsciente, a técnica de cada psicanalista deve ser diferente. Não importa qual a escola de pensamento da qual você venha, isso não deve influenciar a maneira com a qual você vai estar com um paciente, depois com outro e depois com outro. Ou pelo menos não deveria. Mas se a teoria está influenciando você muito ou você o tornando identificável, aí, em minha opinião, você não está mais fazendo psicanálise. Se você segue Winnicott, se segue Lacan ou Bion, ou se vê como um freudiano clássico, você não pode, nesse sentido, ser identificável dessa forma em seu trabalho psicanalítico e estar fazendo psicanálise. Eu não sei se posso responder isso, porque eu não sei mesmo por que isso acontece. Eu só comecei mesmo a escrever como psicanalista no final dos meus 30 anos, o que é tarde do dia, especialmente porque meu doutorado foi em literatura inglesa. Assim, as pessoas esperariam de mim que eu escrevesse e que escrevesse livros antes de escrever ensaios. Eu nunca tive a ambição de ser escritor. E eu só comecei a escrever a pedido de Pontalis, no Review. Ele teria um tópico específico como crença ou qualquer outra coisa, e ele pedia a cada colaborador para escrever algo que fosse curto, que não fosse chato ou tedioso, que não fosse qualquer coisa muito pensada. E eu gostava da forma como o Pontalis lidava posteriormente com esses trabalhos. Isso era nos anos 70. E quem eram os leitores? Bem, eles eram os franceses. Naqueles dias eram os franceses, leitores franceses. E dei-se lá seminários na Universidade de Roma por 20 anos. Na verdade, mais de 20 anos, dos anos entre 1978 até quase o final dos anos 90. E minha audiência era de italianos. E os livros A Sombra do Objeto e A Força do Destino, todos esses artigos foram apresentados primeiramente para os psicanalistas italianos, não para os ingleses ou americanos, e eu gostava bastante da mentalidade da audiência italiana. Eles não eram doutrinários naquela época. Mas até hoje, de alguma maneira, eu acho que os italianos continuam sem saber onde estão. Eles estão dentro da experiência psicanalítica, mas acho que sem conseguirem se identificar com uma orientação particular ou uma leitura particular. E eu acho isso libertador. Eu acho que eu me sentia relaxado. Para mim, a coisa mais importante como escritor é respeitar as perguntas colocadas pelo inconsciente do paciente. Para mim, essa era a única obrigação que eu tinha. Você está aprendendo alguma coisa sobre o paciente e o que é que eles ensinam? Qual é a pergunta? Eu então pergunto, pego minhas perguntas e eu as escrevo e as passo para o meu leitor. Eu suponho que há algo atraente, interessante na minha forma de pensar ou escrever, mas o fato é que eu tenho poucas respostas e muitas perguntas. Tendemos a ter, como profissionais, muitas respostas e poucas perguntas. Nos dizem o que fazer, como perceber, como entender o fenômeno mental, quando, de fato, eu acho que o papel dos examinadores da mente e da experiência psicanalítica é tão complexa para mim, é apenas interminavelmente fascinante, interessante, desafiador, e isso é tudo que eu realmente posso dizer. Eu concordo. Bem, antes de eu me treinar como psicanalista, eu fui treinado como psicoterapeuta nos Estados Unidos, na Universidade de Buffalo, em um programa de psicoterapia para adultos. Ao mesmo tempo, eu fazia um doutorado em literatura, mas naquele tempo, em literatura, e eu tenho certeza de que muitos de vocês que estão me ouvindo podem se lembrar, por volta dos anos 70, havia novas críticas surgindo, especialmente a teoria estrutural. Era o início do pós-modernismo, a teoria crítica. Agora, quando alguém lia um texto, era para ordená-lo de acordo com a abordagem estruturalista. Ou depois da abordagem estruturalista, veio a abordagem pós-colonialista. E depois da abordagem pós-colonialista, veio outra coisa. E as pessoas liam Jacques Derrida como a primeira abordagem desconstrucionista do modernismo e outras camadas. Havia muitas camadas diferentes. Mas esses eram dogmas. Esses foram o início da ideologia. Para aqueles entre nós que se interessavam pela experiência literária, em ler poesia como uma experiência emocional, inspirando uma experiência intelectual, como algo que pode ser transmitido de uma geração para outra por centenas de anos, quer dizer, Shakespeare, centenas de anos atrás. Essa experiência, ou essas experiências, sempre se colocam em risco quando chegam os ideólogos e dizem, não, parem de ler o texto e vamos discutir a posição desse leitor nesse momento particular e nesse lugar particular. E aí o que você faz? Isso é um tipo de praga, então o que você faz? Não é só em psicanálise, mas é em todo e qualquer campo intelectual. Quando as pessoas doutrinárias aparecem, as melhores pessoas devem levantar e ir embora. Vão viajar, se escondam, façam o que tiverem que fazer. Aprendam com os pacientes, aprendam com os livros que estejam lendo, ou com o poema que estejam lendo ou escrevendo, ou dos quadros que estejam pintando. Todos nós, ao longo da história da humanidade, estamos submetidos a formas de encarceramento mental, determinadas pelos poderes que sejam. Não é só na psicanálise. Toda disciplina intelectual ou qualquer um ser suscetível de estar em um estado onde ele ou ela terão de buscar liberdade intelectual em um lugar diferente das catedrais ou igrejas ou institutos de psicanálise.
Persona non grata
É o caso de Lacan na França. Ele era persona non grata, ele foi exilado, expulso. Bion, eu estava na Inglaterra em formação naquela época, e eles não conseguiam encontrar ninguém nos anos 70 que pudesse ensinar, porque os kleinianos de Londres o consideraram completamente maluco. E os únicos que salvaram Bion, e isso vai divertir vocês, foram os brasileiros e os italianos. As pessoas na América do Sul interessaram-se muito por Bion, e os kleinianos de Londres tiveram que tomar uma decisão. Nós perdemos o guia ou nós perdemos o leme? Nós estamos aqui conduzindo o navio Melanie Klein e kleinianos, e de repente esse tipo Bion é mais importante entre todos nós. Nós não temos tempo para ele, mas no Brasil as pessoas estão curvando-se diante de seu nome. Então eles tiveram que aceitá-lo, muito tardiamente, mas tiveram que aceitá-lo. O Winnicott sempre foi considerado uma espécie de palhaço engraçado. O Winnicott, ele mesmo dizia que se fosse ser alguma coisa diferente de psicanalista, ele seria um palhaço. E ele era muito ambíguo em seus escritos, simplesmente poético, e por isso ele desafiava um certo tipo de certeza. Então é interessante para mim que, ainda que tenhamos de nos movimentar entre nossos dogmas e nosso próprio pensamento, nós ainda, e olhando para Lacan, ou Bion, ou Winnicott, encontremos liberdade em seus escritos. E não porque eu acho que eles nos digam como pensar, porque eles não nos dizem. Eles fornecem o básico para pensar, e tudo o que precisamos fazer é ler essas pessoas. Mas, pelo amor de Deus, afastem-se daqueles que os ensinam. Bem, em inglês eu diria I spiked two books. Eu assassinei dois livros. Eu parei dois livros e os coloquei na lata de lixo, o que é difícil de fazer. Mas se o livro é um fracasso e não é bom o suficiente, você fica sem escolher e acaba tendo que fazer isso. E eu estou em uma posição invejável porque eu passei alguns anos trabalhando em dois livros diferentes e ambos nunca serão publicados. Tem ainda um outro projeto, mas eu ainda terei que esperar para ver o que vai surgir. O que vai surgir em meu próprio inconsciente. Eu acho que me antecipei ao meu inconsciente, tentei escrever algo antes que estivesse lá e pronto para ser escrito. Eu acho que eu me levei muito a sério. E é bom aprender com os próprios erros. Então, agora eu estou em um período de baixa. Eu tenho cadernos que eu guardei desde 1974 até agora. Eles são cadernos intelectuais que foram aceitos por uma editora em Londres, mas eu preciso digitá-los. E, infelizmente, seriam milhares de páginas, mas eu não estou ansioso para fazer isso. Eu vou bem devagar e pode levar anos só para ler a minha caligrafia. E é isso que está acontecendo com esses cadernos e é isso que eu estou fazendo por esses dias. Obrigado, o prazer foi meu.
Bye-bye.
I want to thank Whitney and Alan very much for the introductions and to the Townsend Center for inviting me here, and to the spirits of the Avenelli family for this occasion. This is the second time actually I've given a talk at the University of California, and the first time was 49 years ago, across the street, and the topic was mental pain in schizophrenia. It was in Fred Cruz's seminar, a wonderful seminar. And it's, I suppose, an odd time to be talking about mental pain, isn't it? This is a Tuesday evening before the Tuesday in which we're going to all collide in an experience, I expect, harrowing states of mind. I feel a little bit like a surfer teaching the hazards of surfing on Phuket a week before the tsunami hits. That said, I'm going to recall a bit about my talk 49 years ago, because in a way it's relevant to the issue of mental pain, but to the pain, I'm going to try to restrict myself here to the pain that comes with having a mind, because we could speak about all kinds of things that cause us pain, but if we try to stick with the mind, we're on more narrow ground. And I know a little bit more about that, having worked with people whose minds get themselves into difficulty. I hope to read just one thing to you. I'm going to read from Yeats's autobiography. And in the first 10 pages of his autobiography, Yeats describes experiences in his childhood where he was hallucinating. There are interesting descriptions. He clearly went through hallucinatory experiences, what we would call these days schizophrenic episodes. And here's what he writes. I remember very little of childhood, but its pain. I have grown happier with every year of life, as though gradually conquering something in myself. For certainly my miseries were not made by others, but were a part of my own mind. So, when I gave a talk here long ago, it was about a kid who had written poems. And so the talk was about his poetry. And I can still remember one of the stanzas of the poems, which was, I I've got to make it to sex, 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 I've got to make it to sex. I wonder why I remember that. He also kept comic books. They were really more like daily accounts that he kept. He would be composing them during the day. And when he was either composing his comic books or when he was writing his poetry work, actually songs, because he would sing them, he was really experiencing a sort of peace of mind. He enjoyed it. It was helpful. He had a wonderful habit of licking his index finger and walking up to someone and putting it right on their forehead, and the other kids would sort of accept it. This was at the East Bay Activity Center, which no longer exists but was in Oakland, just below the Mormon temple. And so the kid would know at that moment that he was going to be put into the book, that comic book of the day. And this child who was composing this book and who wrote the poetry would say, "This is the fickle finger of fate." And indeed, the children would be fated to be put into the book. Now, when he wasn't writing or thinking, because when he was walking around the school, licking his finger and putting it on people, he was actually composing his book before he actually sat down to write it at the lunch table. But when he wasn't engaged in the act of composition, one way or the other, he was in great, great pain. When he was writing, he would sometimes say, "I'm the master of the universe. I'm the master of the universe." When he was crushed and devastated, he would say, "I'm a shrimp at the bottom of the sea. I'm a shrimp at the bottom of the sea." And he said it with such conviction that all of us around him felt his pain. So I learned something from him without entirely knowing what it was, which is kind of the story of the life of most psychoanalysts and clinicians who have a sort of monastic contemplative life. You sit behind somebody or you work with somebody for hours a week, months, years pass, and you're learning something, although you don't quite know what you're learning. But he helped me with another kid there, who was my primary child to help, who had come out of autism. He was 9. He was strong. He was very, at times quite violent, and a heck of a challenge, but he was wonderful. And anyway, he was my kid. I'd look after him. He would come through the gate to enter the school, and well, depending upon the look on his face or certain gestures, I would know whether the entrance was going to be relatively quiet, phobic, violent. I could even figure out, roughly speaking, who he might attack. So the therapy, so to speak, amounted to my basically trying to find some way to get hold of him and escort him out to the lawn, which overlooked the bay, beautiful view, and then try to back up against the wall of the school and drop down onto the grass and hold him. And I would hold him like that for, oh gosh, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, sometimes, 40 minutes, and this would be any time of the year. So if it was a cold, damp day, I mean, it was soggy bottom time, really, because one would be drenched in the rain or whatever it was that we call it. And he would calm down. He would calm down. I had a lot to learn. He would go home, or he would demand to go home, or by then the school would say he's got to go home, when his pendulum wasn't working. And he had a pendulum in his bedroom, and it would, it was a pendulum, and it had these domino type objects, and if the pendulum was slightly off and it knocked over a domino, he would know it, and he would say, "I have to go home." So we would send him home. So when I asked the Francis Lemon, the clinical director, I said, gosh, I said, have you ever seen his pendulum? And she said, Christopher, there is no pendulum. That's in his mind. I thought, oh, right. I mean, I actually thought there was a pendulum. It's Victor Tausk wrote an essay called The Influencing Machine, and I probably read it 10 years later, whatever, but even if I had read it, I'm not sure it would have been in mine, because it was so convincing. But at that moment, he'd lost his mind. Okay. So every day was like this until one day, and I suppose I got this from the kid who was composing stories. I don't know where else it came from. I said, how about I tell you about an orange ship? Where is it? Well, let's say it's in the Mediterranean. Where in the Mediterranean? I don't know, maybe it's, near Cairo or somewhere like that, and they're going to the Suez. Who's the captain of the ship? I said, well, I don't know. You're the captain of the ship. And so it went from there. So for the next 6-7 months, he would come through the gate, and we would go out together, sit not on the lawn, thank God, on a bench. But I had to tell him the story about the orange ship. And each time was more or less the same script. Whatever port of call we would visit, we had to meet, according to the wishes of the Department of Education in Oakland, some minimal educational requirement. So I would try to teach him a little bit about the world and so on and so forth, throw in a bit about the Acropolis and so on and so forth. But each time that we would go to visit the land on one of these voyages, and by the way, the crew, of course, were all the other children in the school and the staff. So I would describe something about what was to be learned there in the port of call, and he would say, and so-and-so was eaten by an alligator, and so-and-so was picked up by a giant bird and taken away. And so every time there was a landing, there were horrifying events happening to everyone on the ship. And in my own naive way, perhaps, I said, right, well, that's your story, I'll tell you mine, and I would give him a different version. So then, about that 7 or 8 months of this, every single day, and it would take an hour or an hour and a quarter, he started to laugh. And it was a different kind of laugh. He had a very upsetting laugh before this. It was a laugh that was sort of haunting and disturbing. This was a laugh. And he said to me, you don't get it, do you? And obviously I didn't. And I said, what? He said, I'm joking. And that was it. We didn't need to talk about the orange ship anymore. He had gone through a stage in his life, in the life of his mind. The influencing machine, the pendulum was gone, and he just started to get on with life. It had something to do, obviously, with what went on between the two of us. It had a heck of a lot to do with what goes on in all of us when we negotiate and survive the hazards of life. And he just got on with living. So he taught me something. Of course, if we focus on mental pain and the life of the mind, we can say, well, we don't know much about what it's like in the first year or 2, 3 of life. Perhaps the most disturbing mental event we have are our first nightmares, because we don't take them to be nightmares, products of the mind. We take them to be actual events. I mean, I can remember when I was about 5, and my second brother was 3, he would wake the whole house up every few nights because there was a tiger in his room, and it was going to kill him. So my father came in one night and opened up the closet door in our bedroom, and there was this huge commotion going on inside the door, and he went bang, bang, bang. He came out and told my brother, Mark, the tiger is dead. Mark slept peacefully after that, and from that moment on, I was scared to death of my father. So, stories can work. They can help us, and we hear a lot of stories when we're children. I mean, you know the stories, Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny. Squirrels talk to trees that talk to stones. There are friendly brooks. The world is animated in a wonderful way, a very reassuring way. It's sort of like a fairy tale to help us transition from being genuine ingenues. I mean, what the heck do we know as 6-month-olds or 9-month-olds, even though we love to study infantile skills and cognitive capabilities and so on and so forth. Really, we are not very bright in the beginning. We don't really know very much at all. And so it's a long, long time before we can, quote unquote, think properly. So we have wonderful stories are told to us that help us, because we're going to have to go through some pretty difficult transitions. And I think the concept of psychodevelopment is very interesting. It's true, there is psychodevelopment. We do develop biologically and psychologically and neurologically, for sure. But in our need perhaps to gloss over the hazards of life, the complexities of it, we're inclined to sort of not attend to those moments in ordinary moments in childhood, which are just very disturbing, in which it can be said we sort of have breakdowns. I mean, a child who has a nightmare is having a sort of breakdown. I mean, that's sort of what it is. He recovers, or she recovers, through maternal or paternal narrative or interventions. The parents are constantly helping children to recover from very disturbing events. If you even try to say to yourself, well, we're in a family, we've all been in families, right? We take it for granted we know what that is. I don't really think we know what a family is, actually. In the 60s and 70s, Mnuchin and other brave family therapists believed they could assemble a group of folks in a room, families, and get them to talk to each other and sort out through family therapy, family conflict. But after a while, they were so overwhelmed, as you know, they needed to have two-way mirrors in which they would disappear, go back in, have a chat with 3 or 4 colleagues to try to figure out what to do next. Because the conflicts inside the family were such that after a while, a group of 5 or 6 people in the same group called a family, you wouldn't have ever thought they knew each other. You would have thought they never had met each other. But in a way, there are certain things that you can't think. You know, if you've gone and you've seen Mahler's Second Symphony, and you come out of it and someone says, well, tell me about it. What was it like? I can't tell you what it was like. And I can't tell you what my family was like. So there are certain things in life that are unthinkable because we can't think them, not consciously. However, we have assimilated them, we have integrated them into some internal unconscious matrix that is there. Now, when my brother and I get together, having been in the same family, we can talk about it. And so it's in him, it's in me, and so we can share that together because we've been through it together, although experienced it separately and differently, of course, but still we have a sort of inkling of this. So families are sort of unthinkable phenomena, yet the predicate of the family is it set us up for life. And off we go to school, and we think we know where we're going. We go to kindergarten, and guess what? It's perhaps our first experience of group life, a group that's not our family. And so there are other children who come from other families, small do-it-yourself groups, asymmetrical relations, and we're meant to know how to live inside a group. And that's a pretty hazardous experience, and I hope perhaps today we'll have enough time to get to life inside the group mind, because we have problems with our own minds, thinking about things ourselves, but then we're all part of a group mind, which we now know very well indeed as being American citizens, if most of you are, inside a group process called an election, where we have to try to think about what's going on and talk to each other about what's going on. Very, very difficult indeed. But when you go off to school, the complexities of school life, the fact that children can be suddenly very cruel, friendships can terminate at a moment's notice. There's a labile nature to this that we're somehow meant to be able to deal with. It's very, very painful. Now, those of you who are parents who've had children, you know what it's like when your 6-year-old son or daughter comes home, heartbroken, telling you that this friend or that friend or someone has done or said a terrible thing. And they're shocked. And there's a certain kind of look on their face that I'll be talking about in the course of today's lecture, or an attempt at a lecture. There's a look of bewilderment on the child's face. Just bewilderment. They can't think about it. They don't know what's happened. So you then start becoming a sort of psychologist of sorts. You know, you're trying to help them understand how people, quote unquote, change their minds. How don't take it too seriously. But how can you not take seriously the fact that your best friend or a good friend has said something horrible about you, or done something horrible, or you've seen something horrible? And we tend to deny what we have done that's horrible. Somebody's always wrong if they think we've done something horrible, but otherwise we see it outside ourselves. So let's just call those moments when a child comes home, when a child is devastated at school, an ordinary mental breakdown. It's kind of what it is. And what do parents do or teachers do? Well, they do therapy. They help the child recover his or her stability, his or her trust in a way in the group. May have to take a couple of days off school. There may be some parental conferral or maybe some conference to try to repair the damage. But you're also trying to renew the child's, let's call it participation in the stream of consciousness. You just want the kid to get back in the stream of consciousness. You want them to believe that they can go on thinking and dreaming and living their life without being too anxious about things. Ironically, you don't want them to think too much. By the way, every so often I dip into the social sciences and see what the latest stats are. My favorite discovery this year is the research that we are daydreaming 47% of the time during the day. We daydream. I always thought we daydreamed a lot, but I didn't know it was 47% of the time. Secondly, 3 universities have collaborated to study this. When we're daydreaming, we're actually solving problems. And students at university, given complex, very complex mathematical problems that would, that were hard to figure out, that had to do with series, numbers, only 1 out of 10 students was able to solve it in the class consciously. 6 or 7 of them solved it overnight, 3 of them in dreams, and the others while they were daydreaming and not thinking about it at all, just popped into the mind. So part of what they're concluding is that the children who are looking out the windows at school, who seem bored, and who are bored, are more productive than those who are paying intense attention. Very interesting, isn't it? Because what this research is indicating is that the daydreamer, who is given over to unconscious thinking, is actually engaged in intense, deep thinking. Well, okay. So our minds, if we can get back into the stream of consciousness, if we can just get back into unconscious thinking, we can recover as well from the trauma of life. However, well, you probably remember what it was like to be a 7, an 8, or a 9-year-old. I think it's round about then that we realize that although in the previous eras of our life, ages 3 or 4 or 5, we could turn to mom and dad, maybe talk about this, that, or the other thing, get some help, right? 5 or 6, maybe to a teacher or others, and they would help us with whatever was bothering us in our world of thoughts and feelings. But then we start to have pretty upsetting thoughts all by ourselves. First, sexual stirrings will produce ideas. Certain aggressive thoughts will come to mind. Nasty, cruel thoughts, thoughts driven by envy, competition, all these sorts of things. Now, this is when we tend to go rather quiet. We don't tend to turn to people to say, you know, I've had a very strange thought cross my mind. No, we tend to sort of go undercover. In a way, it's the beginning of a type of solitude in which we turn to our mind as a type of companion. Now, my own view is the mind has all along been a kind of companion. I think of it as a sort of a muse. I think, for example, I've often thought of reading Boethius' The Consolation of Philosophy. I mean, I think for him, the muse is rather like the mother holding him in the months before he's to go to his execution. But we all have this muse, if by that we understand this to be the origins of mind itself, which comes as a result of that collaboration between the mother, the father, and others, and our infant self, because mothers are constantly holding us both literally, figuratively, psychically. They set limits, they soothe us, they calm us, they translate us. And so between the maternal mind and the paternal mind and those around us and the cultural mind, the social dreaming that we all live in that perhaps we'll get to later on, we then develop our own mind. But in my view, psychologically, unconsciously, that which was out there in the mother and others and so on, we gradually take into ourselves, remains, as Hannah Arendt says, a type of dialogue which is the two-in-one. For Arendt, the mind is two-in-one. So we have a relation to our own mind, and we'll turn to it at times to say, well, what do I think about this? Whatever. Sometimes we're asked what we think. Well, what do you think? What's on your mind? And consciousness might come up with something. But in fact, much of what we're thinking, of course, we're thinking unconsciously. Much of what we know unconsciously. So there's a very complex relationship going on here, an intra-subjective relationship. I know intersubjectivity is very important, but not more important in my view than intra-subjectivity. What sort of relation do we have to our mind? What kind of conversations do we have with ourselves? It's an interesting world, and I think it's interesting literature, although it's a failed literature, whether it's Georges Bataille's inner experience, whether it's Vygotsky's literature. Whomever is really trying to get to the conversations that we have with ourselves, I haven't read yet an account of it which gets close to what it really feels like for myself and I think for others. So there's a certain kind of inevitable solitude here, isn't there, to the intersubjective relation. Now, by the early part of adolescence, we've only just, let's say, understood what childhood is. I mean, we're, in 5th or 6th grade, we're feeling pretty good. I felt pretty good. I liked kickball, dodgeball, tetherball. I mean, I liked the fact that girls and boys liked each other and, were kind of like, sexuality was just not a big deal. And it was nice, in my view, that it wasn't such a big deal. And so I had lots of girlfriends, as in girlfriends, and boyfriends, and it was really quite nice, quite decent. There were problems, but it was a lot of fun. Then, my God, along comes sexuality, the biology, and we are just not prepared for this at all, not prepared for it at all. And so it's an extremely disturbing event. In fact, it's a form of annihilation. I mean, it's a kind of annihilation. We want to think life is progressive, that each stage makes some kind of sense. We have all sorts of narratives meant to help us to sort of see where we are in the evolution of ourselves. So this is all meant to be rather good. And in fact, in some ways, it's extraordinarily wonderful. But then again, we're beginning to have all kinds of thoughts at an incredible pace that we certainly don't want others to know about. We don't even know really what we think about them. And probably the easiest thing adolescents can say to one another and be absolutely spot on about this, oh, you're two-faced. Right. To be a hypocrite is to be an adolescent. You have to be. It's kind of the beginnings of the false self. You've really got to fake it. And adolescents are, of course, very skillful at developing a place in their groups. It's where the peer group becomes extremely important, doesn't it? Being part of a group, a consensual behavioral pattern, and so on and so forth. Now, all of the so-called mental illnesses, the major ones, begin in adolescence. Whether it's the anorectic's decision to say, you know what, you can all go forward, become adults, I'm out, I'm back to childhood. So they're on strike. And they're pretty intelligent. It's a very intelligent strategy, and it tends to work. Other kids have more disturbed experiences. Those who have manic depressive episodes have a very serious problem with their mind. Those who are schizophrenic have serious problems with their minds. There are far more transient psychotic episodes in adolescence than we're in the least bit prepared to discuss. There are ordinary phenomena in adolescence which we think are wonderful, like the tendency of adolescents to idealize things. We think of idealization as just great, right? We do. But in Great Britain, idealization, maybe it's to do with the weather, idealization is viewed as a sort of psychotic state of mind. So it's not unusual. I mean, in Britain, folks would look at the youngsters going off to ISIS as just rather typical psychotic adolescents. You know, idealizing, you know, the dudes out there in Syria or whatever. You know, yeah, adolescents will do something like that because they're kind of out of their minds. They're idealizing. So some kids will idealize the Peace Corps or Habitat for Humanity and go off and do what are great things, and others will go up and pick up a gun and kill people. But they're still idealizing, okay? Adolescents are, you know, kind of nuts. Now, I'm going to tell you about what I've learned from those adolescents who are having breakdowns. I'm going to talk, excuse me, first about a schizophrenic kid. He's one of the few I can talk to you about. I get a call from the parent. This is typical. 16-year-old kid. Describing the fact that his son was pulled out of a baseball game and has been staring out the window blankly. And would I please see the kid? Sure. Now, kid comes to see me, and he has that look on his face that I told you about with the kid who can't believe what's happened. All people who are having breakdowns, whether they're psychotic breakdowns or non-psychotic breakdowns, have that look of utter bewilderment on their face. I'll come back to that in a minute, but I mention that to you because it's the first visual indication of a person being in really deep trouble. That is breakdown. That is the first indication of it. And guess what? You see it. You see it before your very eyes. Although we tend to negate it, it's there. So he went into the wind-up for a pitch. He was a relief pitcher. He went into the wind-up, and as he was about ready to deliver the ball, he looked over his left shoulder, and the batter and the strike zone were 50 feet behind where they should have been, and they were very small. And he threw the ball, and it went over the batting cage. So he was disturbed. And he went back to the mound, went into another wind-up. Same thing happened. They got small, they disappeared, and he threw the ball over the batting cage again. Coach comes out, begins to talk to him about what went wrong, and he can see that clearly the kid is distressed. He takes him off the mound. And so we're talking about this, and I said, gee, how's your team doing? One of the things you learn is you cannot ask abstract questions to somebody who's had a breakdown. You don't say, how are you feeling? No. You try to stick to the concrete and to the particular. So, how was your team doing? Do you remember the score? Yeah, we were way behind. I'm not going to go into all the details, it would simply take too long. But by going into the details of the situation, by going back in time, bearing in mind this is a person who's in shock, because what happens in the schizophrenic moment is you experience a radical split in the self. So the notions that schizophrenia does not have to do with a split in the self, that's not true. It is actually a split in the self. The first moment in the schizophrenic experience is profound state of shock and being outside yourself, usually watching yourself from a distance. Okay? So there's a radical dissociation. And when I asked him about where he was and what was happening, you have to go back into the everyday. You're taking a history, going to try to find out what happened. He said that just before he went into the wind-up, he heard someone laughing in the stands. And I said, right, laughing. Now, he wasn't saying who was laughing. So I said, somebody, you could hear somebody laugh? Yeah. So, you know who that was? Yeah. So, who was laughing? And he named a girl. I said, wow, oh geez, she laughed. You know her? Sort of. Which, to make a longer account shorter, this was the girl he was in love with. But she didn't know it because he hadn't had the courage to tell her that he was in love with her. But she'd laughed. And that was enough to take him out of himself. That was so shocking, he couldn't recover. And he had a transient psychotic episode. This is the first stage of the schizophrenic process. I mentioned process because it takes several stages. And if you catch it in the beginning, and you can find out how it started, if you can do the history, you first learn why the person dissociated. They then learn why they split and dissociated. So they learn something. You learn something. That's important. But also you get them back into the position where they can speak as an I. I did this, I did that, I thought this, I thought that. Getting them back into the narrative function of speaking of the I, rather than vacating the position of the I, it's extremely important. Okay. In addition to that, I do what I'm sure you would all do. Upon hearing this account, it's heartbreaking. You can't hear something like this without feeling the kid's pain, and it's easy enough to say, oh my God, that's just terrible. It's just awful. Now, it's never been my experience that with a person who's going through a schizophrenic episode, that has brought about tears. It hasn't. They're too far away from that. But if one sticks with one's affections, and I mean by that being speaking with affect, I think we need to be affectionate, i.e. speaking with affect, in order to engage the person's emotional potential. So that's important because you then get back to the potential for an emotional experience. And I'm going to come back to that in a second. But there's something else that is accomplished by going back to the event. Okay? And that is this. Both those who have manic depressive experiences and those who have schizophrenic experiences lose their place in space and in time. Radical dissociation means you lose your location. You're suddenly no longer a part of the everyday. So many times, the next stages will be, at some point, the schizophrenic, the person who will become schizophrenic is going to have to invent a space and a time. So if left to the process, they are going to say at some point, well, I come from another planet. I come from Zion. It's a long way away from here. And I'm 35,000 years old. They're in space and they're in time. They're inventing it. It's got nothing to do with the world around them. And that's the whole point. That they can control. That they can live in. The mind, they have got to recover in that particular way. But that's quite a ways down the road. If you can relocate them in history, in space and in time, if they can get back into that spatial temporal reality, they're going to be okay. It will take a while, but they're going to be okay. They're not going to go on to become full-blown schizophrenics. Now, this is accomplished by talking to them every day. You may have to talk to them for 2 hours or 3 hours, which is not very long given the stakes that are at play here. There is also a period, they do want to get back into the everyday. And there's an awful lot to be said for getting back into the everyday. For Freud, the everyday was the daily residue. But it's the stuff of life. The everyday is the day of lived experience. It's the day of nourishment. It's the day of food for thought. It's where we're nourished by experience. We're nourished by things we see. We've got to get back there to be nourished. So, but there's a problem here because, as you can imagine, they feel terrified now by their mind. They've had a terrifying experience. They don't trust their mind anymore. And you can understand why they don't trust their mind. But they're youngsters. So one of the ways you can help them is to say, hey, look, hey, you were a relief pitcher. You were going in there, your team was down 13-0. You've lost every game in the year. I mean, come on. And then you hear somebody you love laughing. I mean, you know what? You did something that meant you had to get out of the game, right? You threw the ball over the batting cage. It's kind of smart. That's kind of an intelligent thing to do. You got out of there. I mean, you got out of there, right? You got out of there, right? That's a pretty smart thing to do. It's a pretty smart thing to do. And actually, most of what schizophrenic kids do like that, there's an intelligence there. And if you help them to see that it was a form of intelligence, then they get a better feeling for their own mind, their own mental process. Yes, indeed. I guess being crazy is a way to escape unbearable mental pain. Okay? But there's a period then of some mourning, because if you've lost your mind for a while, there is this feeling of abandonment. And so you remember when I said that there's this kind of stare on the kid's face? They have been abandoned. Now, the kids at school have been abandoned by the texture of their belief in life, by all the assumptions that have gone into the stories told them about the wonderful nature of school and children, all the fairy tales. They're stupefied. And so you'll see that look of stupefaction as well with the schizophrenic kid. It will take weeks and months for them to begin to trust their mind again. And so if you work with an adolescent who's schizophrenic, you're going to get telephone calls from them maybe 5 years later or 8 years later or 10 or 12 years later, because there will be memories of the episode when they think it's happening again. And it isn't happening again. What's happening again is they're remembering what happened. So it can take a long time for them to trust their minds again. Now, a fair number of kids will then, interestingly enough, turn to fiction, to reading, or to poetry, to reading fiction or to novels or poetry, although it will take a while for them to do that. It's very interesting. Perhaps it makes sense that if they haven't, let me put it slightly differently, if they've heard voices, if voices have occupied their mind because the subject has disappeared, if the I disappears, then voices will start to show up. That's why it's so crucial to get them into the narrative position. But if you haven't been able to do that, and they then have a full-on schizophrenic episode, they're going to have voices occupying their mind, and that's awful. After that, folks who get to that place aren't going to want to read fiction, aren't going to want to read poetry. Why is that? They don't want any thoughts entering their head anymore. They can't deal with them. They've already gone crazy. Are you kidding? You want me to read this novel? But then, it's very interesting, if that has not happened to them, or those who have recovered through psychotherapy, psychoanalysis, or whatever, or just good enough parental care, they will turn to fiction. They will turn to reading. And because, in a way, it is a way of experiencing an other's mind. I'm not saying that when you read a novel, you're entering the novelist's mind. I'm not saying that. But you are going through an experience that will be painful, often, can be mentally painful. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. You lose yourself in it. It can be disturbing, disorientating. But you get to the feeling of the form of another's mind. You're helped by the form of the mind of the other. And whether you're doing this because you have gone through psychotic episodes as an adolescent, or whether you're doing this simply because there's just something smart about immersing yourself into fiction, about the act of surrender to another's mind and experiencing how they take you through the intensities of mental life and mental pain. Back to emotional experience. Remember, I mentioned that you speak with affection to the adolescent. An emotional experience, movari, is very different from an affect. It's a moving experience. Emotions are not just affects. An emotion is a more complex form of thinking in a way than is a dream, because it's intensely ideational. It's interstitially connected with layered affects. It's deeply unconscious, and it's curative. It's healing. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So what one wants to try to get the schizophrenic kid to go through, or anyone's recovering from a mentally challenging and disturbing experience, is to go through the emotional experience that they would otherwise have gone through had they not been arrested, shocked, and had to go into a radical dissociation. So emotional experiences are very, very essential to our existence. That's, of all the emotional experiences that I know of, that are the most profound emotional experiences, other than, I would say, certain idioms of music, certain forms of music, it's poetry. Because I think great poems do invite you into an emotional experience. And you go into the form of that experience, you endure it. You're not quite sure what you've read, what you've learned, and what is it? That's fine. Because the relation of consciousness to what was unconsciously learned or taken in through the poem, that ambiguity, that tension, that's the stuff of life itself. So every time you read a challenging and interesting poem, you go through something akin to an emotional experience, and I think the writing of a poem for most poets is an emotional experience. That's what it is. How do you get an emotional experience out there, written? It's extremely difficult. So in that way, the poem is a curative event. Let me see where we are with time. Oh, bloody hell, when am I supposed to stop? It's 6:05. Another 5 minutes, 10 minutes? Okay, I'm going to have to, I can't talk to you about the individual who goes through the manic depressive experience, other than to say, as you can imagine, when in a state of depression, there's an incredible sense of betrayal, the loss of the mother mind that was looking after them and feeding them intoxicating thoughts when they were manic. In the manic state, there's a terrible feeling of dread that they're going to succumb to the depressed position, that they'll be back into that horrible state. So here you have a very interesting situation of individuals in great mental pain, oscillating back and forth between two very radically different positions. It takes time to work with this person, but again, talking to them in each one of these two states is very helpful. With folks who are in deep clinical depressions, I just get them to do things. One thought, like, with one kid who hadn't been able to go to work, I said, why don't you just, well, I'm being too cryptic. The first thing I said to him is, look, with a mind like yours, I wouldn't get out of bed either. He wouldn't get out of bed. I wouldn't get out of bed either. Stay in bed. Why try to get up? He would come to his sessions because he would be brought to sessions by someone. Then I said, after working with him for a couple of weeks, I think actually you're on strike. I think this is a strike. I mean, yes, you're depressed, but I think you're saying to the part of you that's excoriating you every morning and saying that you're a bag of rubbish, you're no good, you're awful. This is what was happening to him. So I think you're protesting. I said, that's a pretty good way to protest, isn't it? You're saying, okay, right, if you think this about me, I'll be like this. So he wanted to know what we could do to help him mentally. And I said, I tell you what, why don't you just go back to work? He hadn't been to work for 6 weeks. What should I do when I get? Don't think about it. How long should I be there? I don't know, a minute. Just go to your desk, sit in your chair, and I actually bet him. I wagered him. I said, I'll wager you this, gentleman's bet. I think after about a month, you're going to be okay. How do you know that? Well, I don't really know it, but it's a bet. It's my hunch. Just do it. Don't think about it. So here I was, an analyst, telling somebody not to think. Just do it. I realized this, or I came up with it, not consciously, because after working with him, I did something I hadn't done with any other of my patients. I found it so upsetting. I would walk him to the limousine and put him in the car, because when I first saw him in the waiting room, it was like seeing a 4-year-old child. He was 20, but it was like seeing a 4-year-old who was he was trying to smile, but the smile was turning down, so it was utter helplessness. So, I took him into care, took him down to the car. Then I would walk back, not to my consulting room or back into the house. I'd go for a walk in my garden, which I'd never done before. And I had a basketball court back there, and sometimes I'd shoot a basket or two. Then I'd go back in the house, wait for my next patient. And so I think it must have been out of that my recovery from him was to go for a walk, just to go out into the landscape. And so that's, I think, why I said, just go to work, just get out there. And then he did that. He was able then to get back to work, recovered. And then as time went on, we looked back on what it was like for him to be in such a catastrophic depression. And, well, that's a very long account, and so on and so forth. In the remaining 5 minutes, let me just say very briefly, en passant, the work of history that we talked about here, the therapeutic efficacy of history, is extraordinarily significant. So in the many concept of historicity has to be the concept here that it's to do with, in the world of the self, in the ordinary self, the thinking about one's past, one's history, one's especially recent history, extremely important, especially when one has gone through a psychologically turbulent state of affairs. So we need to rethink the value, in my view, rethink the value of history. We're all part of a group, and we're all part of a group mind. Whether we like it or not, and we don't like it, we are part of a group. So the life of the mind itself is quite overwhelming, and we have many ways to dumb ourselves down. Pairing off, getting married, being parts of clubs, and so on, are ways to dumb ourselves down, because were we to just be occupied by our minds, we would go nuts. It would just be too much. So we have very good ways to dumb ourselves down to be able to bear the complexity of mental life. In groups, the objectification of the complexity of minds and emotions is overwhelming. In Great Britain, there's a training, it's called group relations training, where the analyst learns that his function as the consultant is to help every member in the group understand that whatever he or she says is a function of the group. So someone can say something awful, and the analyst is going to say, the group thinks that. So the individual is not isolated. The group thinks that. So if one were talking to a Trump supporter, etc., one would say, the group thinks that it's unfair to live in this country because we're being left out. That's what you'd say. Now the function here is to detoxify the more toxic sides of affect. It's to try to reverse the paranoid process, because paranoia is where we go to solve the problem of the mind. Why? Because paranoia simplifies mental life. Mental life is at times unbearably complex, and it's much more complex than we actually even want to know about. So we're all narrowing it. Paranoia not only narrows the complexity of the mind, it turns simplicity into pleasure. It turns that pleasure into a form of hate that will stay with one for as long as you want it. Love comes and goes. But if you want to have hate with you all the time, you got a reliable companion. You can hate for the whole of your life, and by God, it's going to be right there with you. So what do we do if part of the way we solve our problems is to get rid of complexity, go towards hate, narrow the realm of thought, and enjoy ourselves? Because the competition here is not necessarily between sanity and insanity, or the psychotic parts of the mind and the non-psychotic parts. That's part of it. But a problem we've got here is that those who would have a more, let's call it, a democratic frame of mind, a more representative mind, where you have most of the dimensions of thoughts in your mind, you're trying to have, think of lots of things to be inclusive, etc. I mean, that's not really pleasurable. That's complicated. It's kind of like the federal government, checks and balances. It's just a world of sort of frustration. Whereas the paranoid mentality is just divine. It's just so delicious. It's so delicious. But we have to see that what we're up against here, therefore, is whether we can bear our minds within the group process, whether we try to pass it off to so-called representatives, electoral representatives, good luck, or whether we decide we're actually going to have to become more involved in meeting opposite minds, trying to stop the polarizations, to try to deter the tendency towards paranoid squeezing and paranoid pleasure, because it's so pleasurable that if allowed to continue, in a sense, we're up against something. By we, I mean those of it, let's call it a more democratic mental process, more inclusive, of more elements, more dimensions. We're going to lose. We'll lose. So I'm sorry to be so cryptic here. I really am. The question, the project, let us say, of how leaders can develop group minds and work with opposite figures to collaborate over and deal with opposing thoughts is a really interesting area. I work a little bit off-piste in advising people in government dealing with very complex issues where there are adversarial states of mind, and getting them to understand that as a group they're responsible for the mind that they're in. We're all inside what we could call social dreaming. All societies dream. We call it culture. We all dream. Every day, every night, the media, whether it's the CNN or the print media, whatever, it's dreaming our dreams, and we contribute to them. And sometimes there are interesting points of convergence. I'm going to end with one. What's on her emails? What is she keeping? What don't we know about her emails? I mean, what is she keeping from us? And by the way, what about his taxes? What is he keeping from us? And And by the way, Dylan, why the hell didn't you respond to the Nobel community? What the hell were you thinking about? Now, in social dreaming, you get these convergences. For Freud, they're nodal points, where cultures, societies begin to converge around particular unconscious fascinations, right, preoccupations, that then gather force and power. And so what's on your mind? I mean, are you keeping something from us? I mean, is it classified? Or what label of classification is it? Is the FBI around? Etc. In other words, there's a certain fear here about what's on the mind and who has the right to privacy. Who has the right to have a mind? Okay. Okay. I'll stop there, and I hope this hasn't been too painful.